If you subscribe to the show, you might be saying, hey, this is not a regular new episode Friday. But that's okay, because this is not a regular new episode. This is a bonus episode. If you're a regular listener to What Was That Like, and you listen to each episode all the way to the end, you probably know that we end every episode with a listener story. I started doing this about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years ago, and it's become a really popular segment. The listener stories are just short stories, like 3 to 5 minutes, or maybe a little longer, that have been sent in by a listener. Everyone has a story they could send in, and that includes you. Yeah, I'm talking to you right now. You have a story that would qualify as a listener story. Because the listener stories aren't the big crazy ones like we do a whole episode about, like getting attacked by a monkey or winning a prize on Wheel of Fortune. No, the listener stories are more like a little interesting slice of life. It could be really happy, or really sad, or really funny. Just something interesting that you can record on your phone and just email it to me at scott@whatwasthatlike.com. So what we're doing today is we're going to hear all of the listener stories that came at the end of each episode for all of 2022. That means that just in this episode, you're going to have like 2 hours worth of stories. So let me know what you think of this. If it's a popular thing, I'll probably do the same thing at the end of 2023. Maybe it'll become a tradition. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this episode with all the listener stories from 2022. Real people in unreal situations.
There is a girl hanging by her broken leg from the telephone wire.
And I called 911 and I said, I found a baby.
I turned around. I see a gun pointed at me close enough I could touch it.
She would hold our heads underwater all the time.
He levels the gun, pulls the trigger, and I go down.
Her eyes were full of tears. She didn't want to leave us.
My hair catches on fire.
I swear to God, this image is burned in my head for the rest of my life.
I'm Scott Johnson, and this is What Was That Like?
Okay, so my work had a gym with it. Now, said gym cost a lot of money. It was like $60 a month. Well, I'm cheap. I don't pay for stuff like that. I'm just, that ain't for me, bro. Well, one week, they were like, hey, we need some more members. So we're going to make it free for anyone who works at this company to go to the gym. And I'm like, okay, bet. Because, I like working out, try to stay in shape and stuff, right? So this gym is nice. Like, dude, they've got like a pool. They've got a whole just decked out weight room, dumbbells going up to like weight I can't even imagine picking up. I mean, they had like a punching bag area. They had a track. It was dope. So, I go get my workout in. I'm getting my pumping, working up a sweat. You know what I'm saying? I'm getting sore, man. I am beat. And I know that this gym has a steam room. And I'm like, oh boy, this is going to be nice. I'm going to go chill in the steam room. You know what I'm saying? I'm going to kind of just cool down, which I find is hilariously ironic because it's a steam room. But, you know what I mean. I'm wanting to go to this steam room, right? And so, I go into the locker room. I stay in my shorts because I'm not a weirdo. And I'm like, all right, cool. We're going to hit this steam room. So I hit up in the steam room. You know what I'm saying? It's nice and steamy. I'm by myself, which is even better because that means I don't have to make awkward conversation with people. And I'm just chilling like a villain. I'm full sprawled out, man. I'm like Gucci. Well, lo and behold, a guy decides to join. And I'm like, all right, that's fine, whatever. And this dude comes in with nothing but like essentially a loincloth of a towel around him. Like, this is a big old swole dude. Like, dude's got muscles on muscles, just into it. Like, loincloth and everything, looking like Tarzan up in this business. And I'm like, okay then. Hey, sup, dude? I do the little head nod, whatever. And he sits on the other side. And I mean, I don't know what day this guy was having, but this guy was just like, he was fuming. He's throwing random swear words. And I'm like, okay, a little crazy. That's fine. You stay on your end. I stay on my end. You know, we're going to be good. Well, homeboy, out of whatever crevasse or pocket that he had, pulls out a shake weight. And I'm like, bro, what? Okay, then. And he just goes to town. I mean, he's getting all the poses, you know what I'm saying? He hitting it from the back, from the front, you know, this guy is getting after pop, 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 pop. I mean, if he wasn't in a steam room, this dude would be working up all sweat. So he getting it for like a solid, it felt like eternity up in there. And I'm sitting in the corner like, oh, this is kind of weird. Cause he's like grunting like, and I'm like, this is weird. This is getting like really weird, Scoob. And eventually he slams the shake weight down, drops a major F-bomb, grabs said shake weight, grabs his towel, and walks out stark naked. And I'm like, bro, what just happened? Like, was that a mating ritual? Like, is this guy wanting me to go home with him? Like, is he the alpha now? I don't know how to feel about this. So next day rolls around and I'm like, all right, man, that was a statistical anomaly. Worst case scenario, I'm going to hit this, I'm going to hit these weights. I'm going to go and I'm going to hit the steam room. I might have some weird old guy with the saggy everything hanging out and it's going to be a good time. It'll be fine. It's going to be fine. That ain't going to happen again. That just statistical anomaly. So I'm in the locker room getting ready, again, shorts because I'm not a weirdo. And I open up the door to the steam room and it was like putting cheese on a mousetrap. The shake weight was sitting there by itself, catching all that steam. And I said, nope. I 180 so quick because I'm like, nah, fam, it's a trap right there. That ain't happening. And, never went in that steam room again.
This is the story of my first experience calling 911. It was frightening. The day was a beautiful New England day. The colors of fall had just started to turn a gentle shade of gold throughout the backfield of my parents' home up in Massachusetts. It was a day where the idea of making cookies just sparked into my head and something that I actually loved doing. The night before, Mom had made a beautiful broiled steak for dinner. It was one of her favorite go-to recipes. And I guess in those days, actually, the broiler was sort of like the microwave today in our household. Fast, easy, and produced a decent meal. As habit prevailed, nobody typically took out the broiler to actually clean the pan because it was a job that all of us hated. So that night, the pan stayed in the oven. The next day, as I had finished making all the dough for the cookies, I turned on the oven to preheat it to a nice warm temperature of about 375. Within minutes, I noticed a smell that was just not quite right. As I turned around and looked into the window of the oven, I saw an amber glow, definitely something not expected when you're preheating the oven for cookies. Panic struck, and I knew that those were flames shooting up inside the oven, something I didn't expect that day. Within seconds, I had called Mom and said, please help me. Something's wrong. Call 911. She came running into the kitchen and immediately dialed our local emergency fire department. Our 911 team was a local volunteer group, which is very typical of New England rural communities. The dispatcher was good enough to explain what to do and what not to do. We followed her instructions to a T and waited outside for the fire department to arrive. As they came, we followed them into the kitchen, and flames had started to come out of the back vent of the oven. Within seconds, they had quickly put out the fire, calmed us down, but honestly, our nerves were rattled as we sat in the cool air on the back step of the kitchen door, just thinking what might have happened. Our dogs were in hand, our hearts were calmed, and our fears put at ease. Thankfully, the oven remained intact and in good shape, as did the rest of our house. Thank you, 911 team in Rochester, Massachusetts. You taught me a lot that day, And Mom, you always taught me by this experience to always clean the broiler when done with it. P.S. The cookies were great. Hello, this is Nancy May, the author of How to Survive 911 Medical Emergencies, a step-by-step guide before, during, and after. This book is available on Amazon.com. In addition, I'm the host of the podcast, Doing It Best with Elder Care Success, where we bring more joy and, yes, more love in the times that we spend taking care of our elderly parents or perhaps a frail spouse or loved one. So come on over to Doing It Best with Elder Care Success or search for Elder Care Success on any of the major podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Tunes, and CastBox. Thanks. We'll see you soon.
This is Mary from Southern California. I'm fairly new to your podcast, and I find that the first-person accounts are so interesting. It gives dimension to the stories, some of which made headlines. Your recent episode of Karen Runge's encounter with poachers and their dogs in South Africa made my heart race because of an experience I had with my dog. This happened in March of 2020. My dog, Mila, was 11 at the time. She's a mixed breed rescue. She's black and caramel in color, and our best guess is Doberman, Beagle, Shepherd, maybe Boxer. She has short hair, ears that flop at the tips, and she can smile. She's 40 pounds of energy, athleticism, and curiosity, and she's super smart and friendly. She and I walk daily, about 4 miles on a fairly consistent route through our suburban quasi-rural neighborhood. It's not unusual to encounter other dogs and even horses on our walks. Most of my neighborhood doesn't have sidewalks, so we typically walk in the street or on the horse trails. On this particular March morning, Mila and I had set out on our usual 7 o'clock walk. Our route took us by a number of houses where dogs would bark as we passed. Being mindful of the early hour, I would do my best to walk on the opposite side of the street so as to keep the barking to a minimum. We were in the last half of our walk, heading south down a side street that wasn't heavily traveled. The only people using that particular street lived in one of the dozen or so houses on the street. For that reason, I usually walked down the middle of the street, checking occasionally behind me for the improbability of a car approaching. We had just turned down this street when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. When I looked behind me, I spotted 2 Rottweilers approaching at a slow trot. I held up my hand and said, "Stay," which they did. Instead of looking curious like most dogs we've encountered, I can only describe them as watchful. To go directly home, I would have had to walk in their direction. I decided instead to pull Mila up close to me and continue walking away at a leisurely pace so as not to encourage them to chase us. I said, "Stay," one more time and turned to walk away. In no time, they were right up next to me. My dog didn't seem alarmed, and I was hopeful that they would all just sniff and move on. But before I could even comprehend what was happening, the larger of the 2 dogs clamped his mouth down on the back of my dog's neck and dragged her to a front yard that we were in front of. He proceeded to press her down, never taking his mouth off of her neck. The most ungodly screaming was coming from her. I, too, was screaming for help. The second Rottweiler was standing next to my dog, and I was afraid that if the larger dog was able to flip Mila over, the second dog would go for her belly. A friend who has had many dogs once told me that if 2 dogs are fighting, you don't grab them by the collar because you don't want your hands that close to their mouth. Instead, you should grab their back legs and pull them apart. I grabbed the dog's back legs in an attempt to do just that. He shifted position in such a sudden, jerky motion that it knocked me down on my back. I again tried to grab anything that I could get a hold of to get him off my dog, but he was so muscular, there was just nothing to grab. I remember realizing that these dogs were killing my dog right in front of me and that I couldn't stop them. The home I was in front of was occupied by an older resident who was likely reluctant to come outside even if she heard me. The house to my left was unoccupied as it was for sale. And the house behind me was newly remodeled, and I doubted that I could be heard through the new windows. Plus, being March, not many people were leaving windows open, so the chances of anyone hearing me screaming were minimal. Then I realized that a car had approached. The driver stopped and came running over. I heard him say, "What are you guys doing out?" as he proceeded to kick the larger dog. As soon as my dog was freed, I asked if he would please drive me home. He said yes, so I managed to get my dog into his car. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was trembling uncontrollably. It took him a few minutes to return to his car, at which point he drove us home. I managed to get his first name, Andrew. I learned later that he recognized the dogs as belonging to his neighbor. He had called the neighbor whose wife came out and got the dogs. Once home, I took Mila into the bathroom where I could wipe her off. Her neck was wet with what I had thought was slobber, but the washcloth came away bloody, so I knew that she was more seriously injured than I originally thought. I took her to our vet, who irrigated and cleaned her wounds. They said they generally didn't do deep cleaning as the tissue was already so damaged, and they didn't want to do further damage. They sent her home with antibiotics and cautioned me to watch for infection. And as it turned out, the wounds became infected, and she had to undergo another surgery with stitches and drains. To give you an idea of how large the Rottweiler was in relation to Mila, the wounds stretched from punctures next to her right ear across to her left shoulder. She was a pretty pitiful sight. I was able to track down our guardian angel, Andrew, who said that he had left for work a little later than usual that morning. Had he left at his normal time, it's unlikely that any other cars would have driven past. I was able to track down the owner of the Rottweilers as well. He admitted that it was his fault that his dogs were out. His automatic gate closer had bumped his truck bumper as he left for work, and unbeknownst to him, the gate had reopened, allowing his dogs to get out. He took full responsibility for the attack, covering all of our vet bills, which were quite extensive. Mila is fully recovered. She's more wary of loose dogs than she used to be. She'll be 13 next month. We still walk every day, not always 4 miles. She determines our route and duration these days. She has severe arthritis in her back legs, but she's still game for walks every day. In so many of your guests' stories, there's a turning point when something just happens at the right time. Had I been able to get the larger dog off my dog, I'm not sure how that would have unfolded. I can't imagine those dogs allowing my dog and I to just retreat. In my case, a guardian angel named Andrew arrived at just the right time.
We don't remember the fact checkers. We remember the storytellers. Just look around. Think about the people that you quote. Think about what you can't wait to tell your friend. Think about when you go to an event. I don't come back and say, here are the stats that I learned. Here's the order in which they presented it. I say, check out this story that I heard. And within those stories are the facts and lessons. So many people get this backwards. Storytelling is how you stand out, and storytelling is how you're remembered. I'm going to wrap this up with a story from my career that allowed us to stand out and expand our reach, our influence, and our income because of not only being able to tell stories, but to bring stories together and to know when to do it. Now, I've told a lot of photography stories in that part of my career because there's so much meaning to it. So many hard lessons were learned during those times. And 2 things I did was shoot sports and shoot weddings. My wife and I, Elizabeth, did the weddings together. Sports I did on my own. They can't sound much different, except they're both kind of action-packed. But you would think that someone that shoots the brutal, blood-spitting, hard-hitting, board-crunching game of hockey would have little connection to the pristine world of weddings. Weddings where little girls have dreamed of that perfect romantic day since they were 7. You would also think that brides want to see nothing but the beautiful details of their perfect wedding day reflected back at them by the photographer that they were choosing. Deep into our wedding photography career, I met with a bride and her dad about her upcoming nuptials. Our approach to meeting with the bride was kind of simple. I brought 2 briefcases, both with a beautiful, modern, and custom-designed wedding album. Those albums allowed us to show 2 full weddings start to finish, displaying not only our storytelling abilities, but the way we captured moments, the way that we saw light, and the quality of our albums. But one evening, before I was to meet with a potential client, I picked up a copy of a magazine that I'd been impatiently waiting for a few days. It was an issue of Sports Illustrated, but not just any issue of Sports Illustrated. It was the issue that, after years of trying, had one of my images prominently displayed. You see, a few months earlier, I'd shot a picture of Pittsburgh Penguins superstar Sidney Crosby that was selected by their editors to be the main 2-page wide photograph that would lead off a feature story that they wrote about him. I couldn't even contain my excitement because Sports Illustrated was one of my favorite magazines growing up, probably the favorite magazine of mine. And as a photographer, it was one of my biggest dreams to get a prominent spot in that magazine. When I got the copy in my hand, I stared at it way longer than I should have. I thought back to all the years where I made no money in the industry. I made a grand total of $20,000 in my first 6 years of shooting, including my time at school. So many emotions flooded my head as I stared at that paper. Wanting to show my friend later on, I put one of the copies in one of the briefcases that held our albums. So I'm at this meeting this night with the bride and her family. Her parents were there, and she seemed to really enjoy our work. Now, the conversation was good, but by no means did I get the vibe that this was something that they were absolutely going to book. Sometimes you just know. We can tell by their language when they're going to book us. They just need to meet us in person just to make sure that we're not total lunatics before they sign the check and the contract. But this meeting wasn't the case. She made it clear that they had met with a handful of photographers and they would make their decision once they evaluated all the options. At the end of the meeting, as I put the album back into the case, I saw the Sports Illustrated at the bottom, and I had an idea. Completely unscripted, I said, "Hey, would you like to see something cool?" And they all agreed. I reached in, pulled out the magazine, and showed them my image. "You shot that?" the bride asked. I went into full storytelling mode. I told them the entire story, including how I had such a bad back problem that I almost didn't even make it to that game. I could hardly walk, and I was awaiting a possible surgery, but I couldn't turn down this assignment. It was with a new agency, and I wouldn't get future work if I said no. I then told the story about how because of this back pain, I got no sleep the night before, and I showed up at the arena realizing that not only did I forget to bring my camera batteries, but one of the 2 cameras that I brought was a broken one that was supposed to be sent into the shop. The entire afternoon was a comedy of errors on my part, and it kept leading down a darker, more painful path. There was a period of time that I didn't think I was going to be able to shoot anything, and I was going to have to go back to this agency and tell them this embarrassing story to obviously never work again for them. Now, even though they knew, seeing the picture, that it turned out right, they were hanging on every word that I was saying. I made sure I took my time and let them feel what I was feeling. They couldn't get enough. I then described the end of the game, when that image was made. Usually, if I'm in good health, I leave my spot to rush back to the photo room, transmit the images as quickly as possible, and get out of there and beat the traffic. But I was in so much pain that I just sat there. I let the crowd file out, and I just waited. But while I sat there, the team announced the 3 stars. It's when they say who the 3 top players of the game are, and the players come back on the ice, the house lights are shut off, and it's nothing but a spotlight on them. It's a pretty cool visual. And Sidney Crosby was awarded the top star for the game. And with nothing but a spotlight on him, he skated onto the ice, spun around, waved his stick towards the crowd, and happened to look right at me. And I fired 1 frame. A month later, Crosby got hit in the mouth, had teeth knocked out, and went out of commission. But after that, he came back better than ever, and Sports Illustrated did a cover story about Sidney Crosby. My picture was the 2-page picture inside for that story. Also, that night when I went to transmit, I didn't even think that much of the image. I was contracted to send 20 images to the agency, and I had sent 19. I chose that one for the 20th, and that was the photo they selected. The bride and her parents sat with their mouths wide open. They looked at each other, then they looked at me. Then they looked at the photograph again. "We want you for our wedding," she declared. Not surprisingly, I kept that image and that magazine in the briefcase. It became routine that near the end of the meeting, I would say, "Do you want to see something cool?" One night, during a meeting with a bride and her dad on the 2nd floor of the Galleria Mall, I asked the same question again. By now, I had this story down. I knew all the details, I figured out what made people gasp, and I knew which words to emphasize. It was almost like it was part of a show. The dad, a highly successful attorney who was really hard to impress, looked towards his daughter and gave a mafia-like nod. "If you're good enough for the Penguins," he declared, while reaching into his pocket, "you're good enough for my daughter." He pulled out his checkbook and handed me a $6,000 check. It took me 6 years to make $20,000 in photography. It took me less than 2 weeks to make more than $20,000 with 1 photograph. That's the power of storytelling, and the greater power of using storytelling to convey a feeling that allows you to stand out in a sea of sameness. Going into those meetings, our company was just one of many. But after hearing that story, we immediately formed a connection that not only won them over, but won them over in a way that they were so excited to not only have us as a wedding photographer, but they wanted one who used the same camera to shoot their pictures that was used to photograph their sports heroes. Those were the words that one bride used to her parents, literally moments before they walked down the aisle. They wouldn't have known that without these stories. We would have been just like everyone else. So as we end this, I want you to think about that for yourself. What are the stories that make you stand out? Not facts, not figures, not numbers. What are the stories that you can tell, even if it's just one, that show why you're different than everybody else? And if you can convey that and you can connect with that, you can open up worlds that you never thought to be possible. Thank you as always for listening to the Total Life Freedom Podcast. We are here to make you better every day because this is your life on freedom.
This is about a time I felt the most scared I've ever felt in my life. It was 2019 and I had booked a work trip to Istanbul with a director friend. We wanted to film this documentary about the most historic, monumental places related to the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And one of our filming spots on our list was this historic landmark called the Galata Tower, which was the tallest building around the Ottoman Empire, and also showed a bird's eye view of the whole city of Istanbul. So when we arrived at our location to film, we were quite late in the day and the queue of tourists surrounding the tower was insanely long. We decided to call it off. We had supper at this nearby cafe, where we came to learn that right next to the Galata Tower is supposed to be this beautiful remote hotel, which was a 400-year-old rickety building and was supposedly the most haunted building in the area. And the tourist guests avoided spending the night at this hotel. So it immediately caught our attention and we went inside this haunted hotel with my director friend. And we went to the front desk to inquire further, where we came across this rather beautiful concierge in his early 20s. A very Timothée Chalamet lookalike, if anything. And there is a reason I'm mentioning his appearance. Anyway, so we told him that we didn't want to stay at this hotel, but if he can tell us more about, if he can confirm us about the hauntings, which he did, that it indeed was a haunted building, supposedly, especially the third floor of this hotel is the one that scares the people away. He kept insisting that he will give us a very good discount if we book to stay in his hotel, in his quite charming smile, but obviously we were not into this. My director friend wasn't keen about this, but I was very keen to film this third floor because it was, obviously it caught my attention. So the following day, I went ahead myself. My director called it off, but I always had a thing for the haunted, macabre places, so I went ahead solo and I thought I would film it on my iPhone anyway and edit it in our documentary somehow. It was around sunset when I checked in front desk with our new concierge acquaintance, and he offered me the high tea menu, which came with the booking. So I had that high tea, and obviously it was dark outside now when I asked this concierge to guide me to the dreaded third floor suite I was there for. The floor itself looked like an ordinary restored old hotel. The big suite bedroom, which was supposedly the most haunted bedroom in this building, was already ajar with the very beautiful ambiance, lights on and everything. I was definitely nervous, but the concierge had this warm, charming smile and I wasn't alone. So I went inside, I immersed myself in filming everything I could about this room, taking selfies, and it took me about 10 minutes to realize that the concierge, Matt, wasn't there. So I had a mini heart attack, obviously. I didn't know when the hell he took off, so I decided to take my leave as well. Obviously I didn't want to be alone in this room. At that point, I realized that the door of the room was locked. I tried to push open the door with all my force. I was having a mini heart attack, and I naturally started shouting and hammering at this door. At the very far end of this room, the bathroom door opened and out came the concierge. I started laughing, rather relieved, because, obviously I wasn't alone, and I had assumed that he had ran off, locked me inside, as some joke. When he came out of the bathroom, he wasn't laughing anymore. Poker face, rather stern expression. Rather, in a way, quite a strange expression on his face. He wore sort of robotic. He came near me and he took my phone from my hand and quickly threw it away. Then he forcibly thrusted me towards the bed. It was this insane blur. It was this mental lapse of things, as my brain wasn't able to acknowledge what was happening at that moment. So I wasn't even fighting back. He was on top of me on this bed and was trying to untie both his and my clothes. So I was frozen both mentally and physically. I didn't think that this sort of fear can be categorized, but I lost my voice. Obviously my attempts to trying to push him away wasn't working on his violent physical force on me, his arms, and all I could muster was please, 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 stop. In a passing moment of trying to think my way out, I stopped struggling when he was on top of me, and to no avail, I started guessing him back, which kind of took him by crazy surprise. My minor cooperation shocked him and his strong physical force on me relaxed. I mean, he looked in my face with like surprise, like obviously, okay, so this girl is into this assault. I'm like, she's consenting to it. I mean, obviously, I had already mentally planned this. So I asked him if I can go to the bathroom. So he was fine. He gestured, okay. So it was when I had locked myself in the bathroom and started shouting like a maniac is when he realized my getaway plan. I think it probably took him 10 to 15 seconds to make a run for it himself and out of the room before anyone came to my rescue. And thus, I saved myself from this horrible incident, rather half saved myself. I mean, in hindsight, I kind of realized that the devils who are malevolent are mostly in human forms rather than 400-year-old specters of a haunted building.
I was stationed in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, on the island of Oahu. Morning of January 13th, 2018, my son and I got up for what we thought was going to be a normal morning, have some breakfast. He wanted to play some video games with me, so we were going to play Madden. And my wife and kids just so happened to be on a vacation back in the States in Florida. So it was going to be a nice quiet morning. So got up, made breakfast, ate, and then got on the Xbox to play some video games. Looked over, saw my phone next to me. I was sitting on the island in the kitchen looking into the living room playing, and I see a bunch of messages and alerts on my phone. So I unlock it. The first thing that pops up isn't even those missed calls or messages. What is it? It's an emergency alert. I've never received any of those. So first thing it said was a ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. Be an active duty military member. You see, this is not a drill. It sets off a little alarm in you because that obviously means they're not playing. This is real. So I call my wife. I run outside. I'm looking towards the western side of the island because being where we are in the Pacific, that's where you would make an assumption that that's where this is going to be coming from. And I didn't know what I was going to see, obviously, but you're not really thinking at that point. All my senses were heightened. I was kind of freaking out. So I call my wife. I'm asking if this is real. I'm asking what she's heard. I'm freaking out. I grab my son and we hop in the car. I'm like, all right, where can I go? I'm thinking, do I need to go over to my unit? Do I need to go and just seek shelter? What am I going to do? So on post, we have shopping areas and grocery stores that we call commissaries, and the PX is that shopping area. I'm like, let's go into one of those big buildings. So we start driving towards the PX. On the way there, we see MPs passing us with megaphones saying, seek shelter. This is not a drill. Get to safety. So we finally park, run inside. We find a place behind one of the portable ATMs and we start calling family. Nobody's picking up. I get a hold of my brother and I'm saying goodbye. I got to talk to my wife and again, I said goodbye. It was one of those times where, first time actually in my life where I felt like I was never going to see my wife again, my kids again. And it was real because there was something that was telling me this is not a drill. This is real. There is a missile inbound and there's not that many military locations that are in our area. So obviously it's going to be us if they're aiming for a military central to the island. And we're freaking out. So I'm making our phone calls and making all of our plans to say our goodbyes. About 38 minutes from the original text, we get one that says, emergency alert. There is no missile threat or danger to the state of Hawaii. Repeat, false alarm. So a bunch of people are walking around inside the store going, it's a false alarm, everybody. It's a false alarm. And by this point, it doesn't really matter who's saying it's a false alarm. You've already kind of thrown your emotions for a loop. But yeah, that was probably one of the worst scares that I've been through in my life, having to sit there and hold my son and wonder if I'm going to be able to make it through the rest of the day to see tomorrow.
Exorcism.
There's stages of demonic attack. She was perhaps the most severe. It was nightmarish.
Money laundering.
Mexican drug cartels, biker gangs in Australia. There are professional money launderers who have clients all over the world.
Graphology.
I can look at somebody's handwriting and I can analyze their character.
Private wrestling.
He wanted me to run over his penis with my car.
Exploration.
It's known as the Savage Mountain. In comparison to Everest, I mean, Everest kind of feels like Disneyland.
Every week on Profoundly Pointless, we explore something new, showcasing a side of life you may never have even heard of. Listen to Profoundly Pointless wherever you listen to podcasts. And that's wherever you listen, not wherever we don't know where they are.
So my story happened on August 19th, 2009. I was living in Minneapolis, and on that day I was driving home from a friend's house in a rainstorm that very quickly turned into a severe thunderstorm with high winds and very bad visibility. I'm driving southbound on 35W, and all of a sudden I see this gigantic tree limb sailing sideways through the air, hundreds of feet, and all of this other debris through the air. And I realized this is very dangerous. I need to get off the highway. I need to get pulled over. So I found an exit, and I pulled into the off-ramp. And just as I was pulling off, another tree branch had slammed into my windshield, cracking it the full width of the windshield. So I slammed on my brakes, still on the exit, not yet onto the other road I was trying to merge on. And I just stopped, knowing that, it's not the best place to stop, but didn't really know what else to do. And then maybe just a second later, I felt my car begin to lift up off the ground, just lurching upward like in a vacuum. And for the next second that just stood still for an eternity, I was terrified. There were no more thoughts, no more words, just the feeling that I'm about to die. And suddenly it was over. Just as quickly as it had come on, my car was on the ground. There was debris everywhere, tree branches everywhere. All of the windows in all the shops around me had been shattered. And I was just screaming my head off. Just, what the fuck? What the fuck? Screaming to myself as I continued to drive home. And then as I got home, then the tornado sirens started. And I hadn't really put everything together yet. I thought, oh, well, the storm was already so crazy, there must be something worse coming. So I took shelter in my bathroom for hours, just watching the news. And then I finally figured out, no, the tornado had already passed. And when I saw the path of where the storm had gone, I realized, oh, it went right through where I had been driving. That moment that I felt the car lift up.
I attended a Christmas party at the White House, so I received an invitation in the mail. There was calligraphy on the outside. Return address said 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I immediately thought that someone was playing a prank. Inside was an invitation that directed me to call the social secretary, and I had to leave some personal information there for me and my guests so that they could vet us beforehand and make sure that we weren't a security risk. I told my girlfriend, last month I brought you to Olive Garden. Next month I'm bringing you to the White House. At the East Wing entrance, it's a lot like the TSA checkpoint at an airport. There was, tons of Secret Service agents. Some were in uniform, some were not. And there's a long list of things that you can't bring in. But people who had accidentally left a lighter or car keys or whatever in their pocket, they still allowed them in because we were reminded that we were guests. And that was pretty cool. Once inside, we walked up some stairs, and then we were in the first floor of the White House. And immediately you start recognizing things that you've seen on TV, like the long hallway where I remember Reagan walking down to a podium to address the nation, or the East Room where they've held concerts and press events and even had funerals there. We took 1 million pictures, and it really didn't seem like there was much security. There was a guard or two that was stationed at the staircase which led up to the president's living quarters, the bedrooms and stuff, but other than that, we kind of had run of the place, at least on that floor. Every president gets to decorate the White House as they choose, and at the time, the president had a dog named Bo. And so there were little Portuguese water dog figurines of Bo everywhere, and there were pictures and stuffed doggies and stuff, and all that's mingled in with portraits of Abe Lincoln and John F. Kennedy on the walls. There were 2 buffets filled with shrimp and finger sandwiches and champagne and stuff to munch on, and I learned later that these type parties are paid for by the president himself, not the government, because a Christmas party isn't considered official business. Our favorite room was the Red Room. It's a small parlor area that was painted in such a rich, deep maroon color. I Googled it later and found out that was Nancy Reagan's favorite room too. And that's also where my girlfriend spilled red wine on an antique couch. The president had an event in North Carolina that day, but halfway through the party, he landed on the south lawn, and I was looking out the window as he left the helicopter, walked into the White House, and gave us a short speech right there in the foyer, right behind the front door that you see on TV but you never see open. It was just really informal. It's his home, after all. The First Lady said hello, told us to clean up before we left, which was a joke. I thought was kind of cute. The president mingled with us for a bit and then said, I got to get back to work. So we wound up staying for another hour or two. Just 200 folks, all meandering throughout the People's House, the White House. We felt like the luckiest people in the world for just a little bit. Shortly afterwards, I married my girlfriend. I think the White House trip really sealed the deal.
I got pregnant with my husband, who is 6'5" and built like a linebacker, really, really thick and strong. So we knew we were going to have a big baby. And I am 5'7", and I was overweight. So I tried to do exercise, and I had pre-gestational diabetes. And so I had an amazing pregnancy, no depression, no anxiety, which is what I live with on a daily basis. But during my pregnancy, everything stabilized, and I was like, oh my God, I need to be pregnant for the rest of my life. It was absolutely amazing. So we get to the end of the pregnancy, and I pass my due date it was the 28th of August, 2007. I'm with the doctor at my regular appointment, and there was a long weekend coming. So I asked the doctor if he could induce me on the Friday so that I didn't have to stay the long weekend pregnant, because I was it was big. The baby was big. I had my stomach get hard, but I wasn't feeling any pain. And this was going on for about a week. So when he checked me, I had been apparently for a week at 4 centimeters and 95% effaced. So I was in active labor, but it was fine. I was fine. My water hadn't broken, so we just stayed there. So on my father's birthday, on the Friday, the 31st of August, we went in for induction. They broke my water at 1:30, and the pain I didn't feel before, well, geez, I felt it now. I've never felt pain like that before. It was really bad. I was hungry, so my husband went and got me a wrap, and I ate it, and then it was time for the epidural to come. And while they were putting it in, apparently it looked like he had to try 2-3 times, and he kept, my husband was looking at the doctor. I'm leaning onto my husband, and every time he would lift his fingers up, there would be blood on it. And my husband was like, oh my gosh, just get it done. So while he was doing this in my back, I needed to throw up. So my husband ran and got a little pail, and I threw up in the pail, and he was so good. He ran to the bathroom to rinse it in the sink, but then realized that there was a grid in the sink hole. So he had to scoop up the chunks and then put it in the toilet and flush it in the toilet. So, once I had the epidural, I felt great. And then I started pushing at 7 p.m. as I was pushing, everything was going really well. And my mom was on one side, my husband was on the other. They were holding my legs to help me push. Sometimes they'd forget to put the legs down after because they were chatting with each other. And then out comes the head. But right before out comes the head, the doctor saw hair. And he's like, oh my gosh, the baby has a lot of hair. And my ex-husband, my husband at the time, was born the same way. So we kind of knew that the baby was going to have hair. We didn't know if it was going to be a boy and a girl. We wanted to keep it a surprise. And then what happened is that the doctor had actually told me to stop pushing because he needed to work the baby's shoulder out of my canal. But I didn't listen. And I just want to get the damn thing out. So I pushed and it ripped to the 4th degree. So I had to have surgery after. And so the baby comes out and I start hemorrhaging and I lost about 1.5 liters of blood. We have about 6 liters of blood in our body. So I was hemorrhaging. It was really bad. I could feel liquid running down my leg. And apparently that was just blood gushing out of me. It was pretty dramatic. They put the baby on me, but I was losing blood, so I was kind of out of it. They took pictures, thank goodness. They were going to stitch me up right then and there. But first they had to get the bleeding to stop. So they had to get my uterus to contract again. So I had one nurse pressing down on my stomach. And I had the doctor with his arm all the way up to his elbow inside of me, trying to contract the uterus. It was so painful. It was worse than having the baby. I guess when they stopped the bleeding, they were going to stitch me up. And I'm like, no, I don't want any more pain. And they're like, no, it's not going to hurt. And I said, everything hurts. They were going to take me into surgery anyways to make sure everything was okay for exploratory. And then they ended up doing the stitching there. So I didn't get to see my daughter, truly see her, because while I was gushing blood, they lost me for about 10 minutes. I was unconscious. I didn't die there, but I was unconscious. And I wake up and I've got my parents who are divorced for a long time, one on one side, one on the other. I woke up and I didn't know if I was really real life because it was weird to see them together. So they've whisked me off now to surgery, and my ex-husband is taking care of the baby. We come to find out later that he had to feed the baby with a tube with his pinky finger because they didn't know if I wanted to breastfeed. Oh, and when the baby came out and my husband was looking and looking and looking, we realized that the absence of a penis meant it was a vagina. So we were all excited it was a girl, and we named her Mia. I'm in surgery and I didn't get out till 11:30. So I don't have the baby in my arms until 11:30. And the whole family had been there. So I come in and all the parents are there and all the step parents and anyways, so many people. So I come in and I'm holding her and try to breastfeed. And, my ex-in-laws are sitting there and I'm like, they're not getting the hint to get the hell out of the room so I can pop my boob out. Anyways, we tried that. It didn't work. So we decided not to breastfeed. I had breast reduction, so we knew this could be a possibility. He gave me Mia and put her in my arms, and I have pictures of it, and it shows how out of it I am, how yellow I am, because I was anemic and it was pretty bad. But for a whole day and a half, I did not connect with Mia. I was crying to my mom in the middle of the night, give her back. I don't want her, take her away. And I got it all out, and my mom looked at me, and she's a tough mom, and she was a nurse, and she's an amazing woman. And she looked at me, she said, okay, that's enough. Suck it up. You got this. She's your baby. So after that, I started connecting with Mia, and because I was able to hold her. Before I didn't have any energy. So I got out of bed and I took a walk with her, and I really bonded with her during that walk, and it was absolutely amazing. The next morning Well, the morning after I gave birth, my husband came back. He couldn't sleep at the hospital, so he came back. He still has the bloody jeans on, the bloody shoes. And he just wanted to get back there. He's a very loving father. So he came back, and we have a beautiful girl. Now she's 13. Oh, I'm sorry. No, she's 14, and she's 5'11", much taller than her mama. She's built like her dad. She plays hockey, and that thick hair never went away. A lot of people would comment on her hair when she was a baby. She was just a really happy, funny baby. Big smiles, always giggling, always smiling. Those first 3 years watching her grow were absolutely amazing. We got a divorce after 3 years, so it changed the dynamic, but she's just amazing. And to watch her grow, and I know people say this all the time, oh, it goes so fast. And it used to annoy me, and I'd be like, yeah. Well, it does. She's 14 and in grade 9 in high school, and it's just unbelievable. It really is a miracle that we can form these little creatures in our tummies, and that they come out and they're 9 pounds, 1 ounce. That's what I forgot to say. 9 pounds, 1 ounce, 21 inches. She was very long and very big. Thank you for listening. And Scott, love your show.
This incident happened on the west coast of Canada while I was being held captive by human traffickers who also traded in weapons and drugs. The traffickers had taken my shoes, my ID, and my jacket, and most of the time kept me confined to a single room. In trying to gain my compliance, the traffickers used food deprivation, sleep deprivation, sexual assault, and other violence. There was always someone directly guarding me, and usually 4 or more traffickers in the residence at any given time. When there are people around to witness psychological, sexual, or physical violence, and those people do nothing to stop or object to the infliction of harm, it makes that mistreatment even more intimidating and brainwashing. I had 3 things that were helping me navigate the situation. I knew how to disassociate from pain in my body. I was determined to do whatever it took to survive. And I had escaped human trafficking before. On the night of this particular incident, no amount of disassociation or determination could save me. One moment I was being tossed around the room and beaten. The next I was being strangled on the floor. Fighting back was inefficient. My limbs became sluggish, then lost function. I watched my arms fall to the floor and thought, oh, my arms aren't working. Couldn't move my legs. I knew what that meant, but couldn't do anything about it. My head lolled to the side. I saw a piece of lint on the carpet, just a wee fluff of carpet lint, and thought, I'm going to die looking at this carpet, and no one will know what happened to me. Mom's going to be so disappointed. I felt sad more than scared. Vision went red and then black. Last thing I remember feeling was that sadness, and his hands around my neck. I woke up on that same carpet, with the culprit watching me to find out if I was dead. Waking up, I was very disoriented. I didn't know where I was or have any recollection of what had happened. I remember looking around the room, trying to remember who had brought me to this strange place and if I was on drugs, because my body felt so strange. It wasn't moving properly, and my thoughts were mushy. When I finally could move, everything hurt. And then I remembered. That was when I realized that resistance wasn't going to build my escape, that I had to feign subservience until the traffickers got sloppy. So that's what I did. And luckily, the plan worked. After I escaped, I started studying martial arts, and learned how to defend myself and how to avoid being in that kind of situation again. But I warn you this, it can happen to anyone. Human traffickers are scum.
Now this story is true. It happened about 2 years ago when I bought a new house. Got kind of lucky because the market dipped during the pandemic. Now the house was a total wreck. I don't know for sure, but I suspect the woman who lived here before was an alcoholic and lived alone. There were plates and silverware in the front lawn. The grass was growing up to my shoulders almost, and it took months of cleaning and repair to get it livable. Now, I'm pretty lucky in that my dad is a contractor, and he was trained as a carpenter, and so one of the things we did together was remodel the kitchen. We tore out all the old cabinets and the tiles, put in a new sink. It was a couple of months of putting in 40 to 50 hours every week, but it paid off, and the kitchen looks great now. But I want to tell you about what happened when we were right in the middle of the kitchen remodel. Now, I rent the house out now to a couple other roommates to help pay the mortgage, but at the time I was living here alone, and when I woke up and opened my bedroom door on the second floor, I heard the sound of someone taking a shower downstairs. Now, that's impossible because I was the only one there. And as I walked down the stairs in a kind of half-awake state, I noticed that the living room looked like a sauna or a steam room. There were water droplets pooling on the ceiling, dripping down. All walls were also covered in water, and there was a thick fog so that you could almost not see 5 or 6 feet ahead of you. Now, when I turned the corner at the bottom of the stairs and looked into the entryway to the kitchen, what I saw absolutely shocked me. And we had taken out the sink and all the cabinets, and we had the new cabinets ready to place. So where the kitchen sink was were the 2 water lines, hot and cold, sticking straight up. And when we had left our work for the day the previous night, the knobs were turned firmly off. But on this morning, when I looked into the kitchen, the hot water line was fully opened and spraying a fairly thick stream of water directly into the ceiling, about 10 feet overhead, which was then cascading down like a fountain. It looked like something you'd see at a water park. The floor was flooded with water, and since it was the hot water, it was putting off massive amounts of steam. I immediately panicked. I don't know anything about plumbing, so I called my dad right away. I'm sure I sounded kind of insane and told him what was going on. I hung up the phone and went over to the water line to see if there was anything I could do to shut it off. And all I did was turn the knob and the water turned off. Probably turned it maybe 2 good rotations. Over the next 24 hours or so, we spent with a wet vac in the basement, vacuuming up, probably over 100 gallons of water. It was a good way to clean the basement floor, and luckily only a couple of the cabinets were ruined, so we weren't out that much money. It actually could have been much, much worse. But the thing that I can't figure out is how the water line got open in the first place. I know I didn't do it. Now, I have been known to sleepwalk, but I would say the chances that I did this are maybe 1 in 1,000 or 100,000. I guess it's possible. I know no one else was living in the house. I know that my 2 cats don't have the necessary dexterity in their paws to turn a handle like that. And there were no signs of anybody breaking in. Plus, it was an empty house with nothing to steal, unless it was a kid playing an elaborate prank with basically no motivation. To this day, we have no idea who did it. Now, as I said, my dad works in construction and came up as a carpenter, and I asked him in his 40 or so years of practice in the trade whether he'd ever had a situation like that or something similar, and he said never. He'd never seen a water line just open. Well, that next weekend, I got some sage from my sister, and though I don't necessarily believe in ghosts, I saged every room of the house and also prayed whatever kind of prayers I could think of. And knock on wood, to this day, about 2 years later, we haven't had anything besides for a few noises in the attic, but nothing like that has happened again. So if you enjoyed this story, if you enjoyed my voice, maybe you would like my podcast where I tell true crime stories. I mainly stick to ones you haven't heard before, the more fringe, bizarre ones. If you do want to check us out, go to tapesfromthedarkside.com. Again, that's tapesfromthedarkside.com, or just search for Tapes from the Dark Side in your pod player, including Spotify and Apple, and maybe I'll see you guys on my feed.
Last year I went out climbing with a friend, just her and I. I always gone climbing with her and another friend, never just the two of us, and she's a bit spacey. She warned me that she wanted to do a climb that had this hard part that I will potentially have to ascend my rope to get through, especially if I fall away from the wall and I'm dangling in midair, unable to reach the wall again. Well, that happened, and I never ascended my own rope before, but I found myself with some gear on my harness 200 feet off the ground, and I tried to figure it out. This was right after, in the middle of COVID, quarantine, so I was about 20 pounds heavier than I usually am, hence why I fell off the climb. It was August, so I was in direct sunlight, well above the tree line, baking in the sun, and I had no idea how to ascend my rope. And I didn't have my phone on me because I didn't have pockets, naturally. But I did have my watch on, so I paid attention to the passage of time and how long I was in my harness. I couldn't hear my belayer, and she couldn't hear me. We were screaming each other's names the entire time, but we couldn't hear each other because there was a sound barrier. So I was dangling for a long time before that was addressed. But until then, I was trying to set up a self-rescue system, and I was like most of the way there, but I didn't have a way to capture my progress. So when I, take slack out of the climbing rope, I would just stand up and there was slack. I wasn't actually like making the rope tight where my new position on the climb was. So I didn't know what I was doing. I was really just flying by the seat of my pants and making up a way to self-rescue myself out of this. A climber came up the route next to me. I was able to get his attention, and he was trying to help me set up my rescue system. But at this point, I've been dangling for over an hour in direct sunlight. My hip flexors were definitely starting to get damaged at this point. And there's something called harness trauma that can kill you after 20 minutes of dangling in a harness. But I had made it this far, an hour and a half, still trying to rescue myself. And I ultimately couldn't get myself to ascend the rope because I was just so busted from dangling in the sun. So we had some other friends that were at the cliff that day that did have their phones on them. So my belayer called them over, and I was yelling to them, and they were on the phone with my belayer. So they were able to communicate to lower me to the belay ledge where those other climbers were, which was only about 10 feet away from me. And I rappelled down with that party. So I got to the ground safely after about 2 hours. And my hip flexors were really, really messed up for 2 weeks after that. Like I couldn't climb, I couldn't work out. I was walking kind of funny because I could have died in a fraction of the time that I was really dangling there. And the weird part about this whole story is that it ends with sirens. There were sirens that we heard when we got to the base of the cliff, and my friend eerily said, "We don't like to hear that around here because usually it means a climber died," which unfortunately happens at the Gunks a lot because of its proximity to New York City. There's just a lot of climbers that go up there, and like myself, a lot of them don't know what they were doing, but they'll go on and lead climb. I was just following someone, so I was on top rope, which is generally much safer, less scary, generally. So we heard sirens when we got to the ground. You don't like to hear that around here. And it turned out to be another climber, a female climber, my age, who her gear had ripped out of the wall. She fell while trying to set an anchor, and she was guiding a group. She was a well-known member of the community and fell to her death on a day that I almost died as well. So I had a lot of survivor's guilt after that. It definitely got me in the mindset to improve myself as a climber, to learn rescue, to get my strength back, and to lose that quarantine weight. And now I go back to the Gunks myself, and I do the routes that I want to do that I won't get my followers stuck on. So If you ever go out climbing, make sure you cover with your partner everything that could go wrong. Wasps, snakes, falling rock, dangling in midair, you name it. Cover that, please.
Hey, this is Scott. Since we're talking about weddings today, I figured I'd tell you about when my wife, Jeannie, and I got married and what went wrong. Actually, it started before the wedding. At some point, Jeannie happened to look at her engagement ring, and she was quite surprised to see that the stone was gone. It just wasn't there. Turns out this was due to it being improperly mounted, so we took it back to the jeweler and explained what happened. They put another stone in. But of course, now she's kind of paranoid, always looking at it, wondering if this one's going to fall out too. So we get to the day of the wedding. The actual ceremony was scheduled for the afternoon. Jeannie had made prior arrangements with a local beautician to have her hair done that morning. It was all set up. The hairstyle she wanted, the appointment time, all of that was arranged in advance. So she goes to the salon that morning, and the stylist is not there. The manager calls her, and the girl's response was, "Why would I be there today? It's my day off." So Jeannie's kind of upset, and she tells the manager it has to be today because of the wedding. And the manager's like, "Oh, you're in the wedding party?" And Jeannie says, "I'm the bride." Fortunately, one of the other stylists there stepped up and did a great job, but it was kind of a stressful start to the wedding day. For the men in the wedding, which was my dad, my two younger brothers, and my best friend Tim, we spent the morning getting fitted because the tuxes were all late in arriving. So we had to go and try them on and have some alterations because there were some things that just didn't fit right. The worst of that was the tux for my youngest brother, Sean, who was about 13 at the time. He ended up with a shirt that had sleeves that were way too long. But, of course, no time to order another shirt. So the fix was the shirt sleeves were actually just sewn to the jacket sleeves with just a little bit of shirt sleeve showing. So it kind of looked normal. The downside is he couldn't ever take off the jacket, which itself was too small. That comes into play a little later. My wife's family is from Maine, and we're getting married in Florida, so they all flew down, and one of her sisters came in with her husband, and they rented a car while they were here. Well, traffic and driving here in Florida is very different than the country roads of rural Maine. On the way to the church, her sister was driving the rental car and crashed into the back of another car. No one was injured, but the car did sustain some damage. Her sister still visits Florida every year, but has not driven a car here since then. Anyway, we all made it to the church, and the ceremony begins. All of the groomsmen and bridesmaids are at the front, and Jeannie and I are saying our wedding vows. Now, the funny thing to keep in mind is that this was a small country church, and the air conditioning just wasn't powerful enough to keep the room cool. This is Florida in July. It was terribly hot outside and uncomfortably warm inside. So while we're saying our vows, my little brother, the one with the poorly fitting shirt and the jacket that he can't remove, well, he's getting overheated. And he's standing there for an extended period of time with his knees locked. And he passed out. Just dropped like a rock. The videographer at that moment had his video camera focused on Jeannie and me, so in the video you don't see Sean fall, you just see the expression on our faces when we realize what happened. You do hear the fall, though, because he hit a bench on the way down. He wasn't out for long, and he wasn't injured, just embarrassed. But the ceremony went on, and we got married, and we headed off to Daytona Beach for our honeymoon. And while we were there, the stone actually did fall out of her engagement ring again, and this time the jeweler wouldn't replace it because it looks like we're just trying to scam them for more diamonds. In the long run, it all worked out. On July 7, just a few days from now, we'll celebrate 38 years.
Some stories you just have to experience to believe that they actually happened. This is definitely one of those stories. So I'm at a favorite client's house of mine. This family used to be home every time I'd visit, but now they're traveling the country and in the husband's new role as a consultant. And so I clean an empty house, a big house, 3,000 square feet, very nice, suburbia, 3-car garage. I would park my vehicle just outside the garage on the driveway, and I would go and grab the key from the front because they would leave it in a little dish for me. And then I would go open the back door with the key, go into the garage, open the back door with the key, type in the combo on the padlock in the kitchen to turn the alarm off, and then I would commence my cleaning. So normally I would bring all my gear in and do that process. Well, on this one particular visit, I did not get all my gear in. I forgot a few things, but I got most of my stuff in. Obviously, I got the key from the front porch. I walked around the back. I let myself in, opened up the back kitchen door, turned off the alarm, and started to work. Realized I forgot some paper towels, a filter bag for my vacuum, a couple cleaning supplies I forgot. So I went to go back outside to grab the pieces that I needed to clean the house. And so if you can imagine this large kitchen with an eat-in, and then there's a side door that goes into the garage, and the family uses this door. They would park in the garage. In most households, they don't use their front door, let's be honest. They use their side door. And this side door opened up into the garage, which was the main entrance in and out of the house for the family, and it's the one that I used. When I opened that door, I walked down those steps. As I'm walking down, I pressed the button on the garage door, and the door started to open. So I was walking down the steps, across the concrete. I looked out the side windows. I noticed there was a squad car sitting in the driveway. I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. What's the cop doing there? So my first thought goes to, oh, well, gee, you know what? I've had half a dozen times where maybe I tripped an alarm or I forgot something and I opened up a door that was not triggered to. There's all different ways that you can trip alarms. And the cops would come and they would show up and they would ask me for ID and make sure that, I was supposed to be there. And I've been through this before. So my first thought was, oh, look, a squad car. I must have tripped something. Who knows? I didn't realize where the cops were and I didn't know the background of what was going on. So I'll just take you from my angle. And so I proceeded to walk, and this is like in like the Matrix slow motion, like here's the garage door opening, here's my footsteps, clunk, clunk, clunk. I see the squad car. I get closer to the garage door is opening. I'm about 10 feet away. I see a pair of black boots at the bottom of this garage door. It keeps going up, and then that reveals a pair of gray pants with a blue stripe on the side. I recognize that immediately as, oh, that's a policeman, I suppose. So I walked closer to the door. The door gets to waist level. I see his bottom, and I see the sidearm being pulled up. At the moment that I see that, the nice man in blue says, "Get on your knees." I'm like, yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I got down on my knees as quick as I could. Knees hit the pavement. Ouch. The door keeps going up, revealing the rest of the cop and the patrolman that was with him, his partner, both of them, guns pointing at the cleaner in the garage. Why? I don't know what I did wrong. Did I not flush the toilet last time I was there? I don't know. What did I do wrong? But I just was on my knees waiting for my instructions. He says, "What are you doing here?" I said, I'm just the cleaner, sir." He looks at me. He sees I have a cleaning shirt on. He says, "Is that your vehicle?" I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "Don't move." He sends the partner over. "Hey, go check out his car." He goes over, looks at the car, and I hear back, "Yup, here's a cleaner. I see a vacuum cleaner stuff in here. I see some other things. Unless he's got a really good ruse or he's a con man, I think he really is a cleaner." "All right, let me see what you got in your pocket." I said, "Sir, all I have in here is my wallet, which doesn't have much money in it, and my keys. Here you go." He's like, "Do it slowly." I'm like being interrogated like I'm a criminal. This is crazy. Gun still pointed at me. Eventually, he lets off of the tension and he says, "Okay, you can stand up now. Looks like you're good. I need to see your license and your ID." I said, "Yes, sir." I got my wallet out, gave him my ID, and he did a check. I just kind of stood there now. And at this point, the partner is running a full-scale background check on me to make sure I am who I say I am. And of course, my name probably shows up as, yes, cleaner, been background checked 5 times in the past year for tripping other alarms. And so I finally talked to the officer who had cooled down, gun back in holster. And now I'm kind of, my heartbeat, which was fluttering like a butterfly only moments before, and I'm freaked out. I just start joking around. I don't know where the jokes came from. I really don't know. Why did I think this was funny? I don't know. I guess I spend too much time alone cleaning houses to think, but I did think it was funny. And so here's what I asked him. I said, so, officer, why did you point a gun at me? I'm just a cleaner. And he says, we had reason to believe that this house was being burglarized. I said, okay, sir, that makes sense. I can understand that, sir. Why would you think that I was burglarizing the house? They said, we got a tip. Okay, what kind of tip did you get? They said, well, one of the neighbors had called and they saw suspicious activity. I said, suspicious activity? You mean like I was vacuuming and cleaning a bathroom? Was that suspicious to them? He's like, all right, wise guy. Like, I need to shut up sometimes. I really do. He said, no. They said that they saw an unidentified man go to the front of the house, looking all around, trying to break in. And then they saw him disappear to the back of the house, looking around, trying to break in. Then suddenly he wasn't in the back of the house or the front of the house. Somehow he was in the house with the lights on. So they immediately called the cops to report it. So of course I explained my situation. Let me explain this, officer. I went to the front of the house because that's where the homeowner leaves the key for me. Then I went to the back of the house because that's where the door that the key works for unlocks. And then I went in the house to clean. So I am very sorry for any misunderstanding. May I go now? And he says, let me just check a few more things out here, bucko. And I added the bucko. And sure enough, after a few more moments, at this point, I'm kind of goofing around with the partner and, asking if he's done this before, if he's ever, pointed a gun at a cleaner or a roofer or a plumber. Of course, I'm just being a wise guy. And then I finally get let go. They take off. They write their report. I go back in to clean. I go back. I call the homeowners to let them know what happened. I said, Mr. and Mrs., so-and-so, just want to let you know what happened. They are freaking out. They are not happy with the situation. And they go as far as to call the police station and to call the neighbor and to report everything and to let them know in the future that there is a gentleman that comes to our house once a month. He has this car. He cleans for us. He is not a burglar. Crazy things happen. Crazy things. So I've never had a gun pointed on me in my days of growing up in the Philadelphia area, the Philadelphia suburbs, doing dumb things as a teenager. Never had a gun pulled on me until I was cleaning a house in suburbia.
Hi, my name is Alex, and this is how shoveling snow as a kid got me a job later in life when I needed it the most. During snow days and weekends when we would get a lot of snow in upstate New York, I would go around and shovel people's driveways, walkways, shovel their cars out. But instead of asking for money first, I would just do the job. And I had a little almost business card that I would tape to their door with how much they owed me if they wanted to pay. Some people didn't. Most people did. I'd find it in my mailbox, or they would call and have me come pick it up. And I did this from when I was about 10 or 11 to when I was 13 or 14. I grew up super poor with not a lot of money, and I just had to fund things myself. It's how I bought my PS2 in, I think, the year 2000. Years and years later, I experienced a long bout of homelessness. It just is what it is. It was an experience that I now know gives me strength, and I have something to always look back on knowing where I came from. And after years of homelessness, I finally got the strength up and be like, I need to find a better job. So what I did is I had a gym membership to Planet Fitness at the time, and I took the best clothes I had and washed them in the sink as best as I could, and I used hand sanitizing soap to wash them, to make them as clean as I could. And I hung them outside, and they dried after a day or so. And I went and I applied to a big box hardware store. The day came for my interview, and I was so nervous, and I assumed that they would know I was homeless because I was scraggly, or that they would just know that I didn't have a home. So I sit down on an interview, and a guy walks in, introduces himself, and sits down, and he looks at me strangely, and I first thought, oh, he knows immediately, I've got to leave. But I stayed because I really wanted the job. And after maybe 10, 20 minutes of an interview, he said, did you used to live on X road, the road that I used to live on? And I went, yeah, I lived down there when I was a kid. And he was like, did you used to shovel my driveway? And I was like, I shoveled lots of driveways. I assumed that I did. And his face lit up, and he said, I always wondered who did it. I always wondered what happened, and because I loved the drive. And he wanted to say he was so busy working that he didn't get to see his kids as much as he wanted to. But me shoveling gave him just that little time before they went to school, before he went to work, to give him time to spend with his children. So I was like, oh, that's really great. And the emotion in his face, he didn't even interview me anymore. He just gave me the job on the spot. He was like, if that work ethic is the same work ethic you have now, then you're going to be perfect for this job. I'll never forget that man and what he did for me, because, now I'm married with children and I have a home all of my own. And that all started from that. I can just think back that it all started from that one day of start to shoveling snow to where I ended up today.
My name is Kathy, and this is a story about the time as a little girl I got lost in the Mojave Desert. I grew up in Southern California, and my family spent a lot of time camping in the Mojave. On one trip, when I was about 11 years old, I wanted to tag along with my dad, my brother, and a friend of my dad's while they went out to hunt rabbits. I had a hard time keeping up with them. I tried to take a shortcut to catch up, and in doing so, my foot slipped off a rock and I was punctured by the thick, sharp point of a century plant. Since I was only wearing canvas sneakers, the point went through the side of my foot and I was bleeding quite a bit. My dad came back to find me, and when I showed him my foot, he told me to go back to camp. I guess he assumed I knew how to get back. Well, I didn't. Before I knew it, I was hopelessly lost. As I kept walking, I found myself atop some huge boulders, some as big as a car. I started climbing down. By this time I was getting worried, but not too much. I found myself on a boulder that was too big to jump off to the next one, so I laid on my belly and started sliding down. I thought I was touching the next boulder, so I let go. Well, I wasn't touching, and I fell hard onto that rock. That was it. I started crying and screaming, "Mom! Mom!" I had no idea if she could hear me, but after a few minutes she did. She kept calling my name so I could find my way back to camp. Needless to say, my mom was fuming mad. She called my dad an SOB and said, I hope he doesn't get any rabbits. I was just relieved to be safely back at camp.
I always loved to play soccer as a kid. When I was 13, I started to notice that running was a lot harder than it used to be. It felt like one day I could run the mile at practice with no problem. The next, I was short of breath, lightheaded, and on the verge of passing out. That year, I was diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, or HCM. Living with HCM just kind of became my new normal. As crazy as it sounds, one of the primary risks for people with HCM is sudden cardiac arrest. While no cure exists, a preventative treatment option for this is something called an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, or ICD for short. And it does exactly what an external defibrillator can do. It administers life-saving shocks to a heart in the event of a cardiac arrest. As you might imagine, if my heart ever needed a shock from the ICD, chances are I would be out cold, unconscious, and wouldn't feel a thing. But just in case I ever received what the medical community calls an inappropriate shock, I was given a magnet to carry with me at all times. These aren't ordinary fridge magnets. They're heavy, donut-shaped magnets, powerful enough to turn ICDs off simply by placing one on your chest over the device. In 2010, I was 18 years old, living at home and pregnant. One night in early January, I was laying on my parents' bed talking to my mom. Out of nowhere, I was hit by a wave of pain so intense it felt like an invisible force had exploded inside my body, accompanied by a loud bang that only I could hear. I instinctively cried out as my body twisted in pain. Before my mom and I could figure out what was going on, it happened again, and I let out another blood-curdling scream. My whole body felt nothing but crippling, searing pain. Whatever was happening only lasted a second, but it was coming from an unseen, unknown source, and I was terrified. That's when I realized that my ICD was firing and I was receiving inappropriate shocks. This wasn't supposed to happen. I was awake, conscious. I wasn't in cardiac arrest. I felt fine. There's no reason why my ICD should be firing. I frantically yelled for someone to grab my magnet off the kitchen fridge. Relief washed over me when I placed it over my chest. I thought the nightmare was over. But my sense of relief was abandoned seconds later when I was shocked again. At this point, most of my family was in the room trying to figure out what the hell was going on. We only lived a few blocks from the hospital, so they lifted me up from the bed to help me get dressed before leaving. As I went to put on my coat, I was shocked again. At this point, I had placed 2 to 3 magnets over my chest, but something was wrong and the magnets weren't working. I knew this probably wasn't going to stop and we needed help. My siblings watched in horror as my parents walked me down our sidewalk to the truck. Each time the ICD went off, I let out a toe-curling scream and my body would crumble. I remember trying to step into the back seat, but the sheer force of another shock pushed me face forward onto my stomach. The pain was so intense that I started to black out. I was shocked a few more times on the way to the hospital and almost lost consciousness with each one. My dad drove like a madman to the emergency room where we were greeted by 2 nurses with a gurney. As they rushed me inside, I was begging for relief, saying, "Please just put me to sleep, please." But a nurse turned to me and said, "I'm sorry, we can't do that because you're pregnant." However, it didn't take long for the staff to realize I needed something to make me drowsy, something to help with the pain. Then they called the only defibrillator technician within a 50-mile radius who had the ability to turn the damn thing off. While we waited for him to arrive, the shocks continued every few minutes. Each time I would cry out in pain and my body would bend and flex out of shape. I bit my tongue several times and remember tasting the blood in my mouth. I had never felt pain like that in my entire life, and I just wanted relief so badly. When the ICD tech arrived, he opened what I call the suitcase. They'd used this system since I was 13 to read the data on my device, adjust settings, turn it on and off, check battery life, etc. But even the tech couldn't seem to get a reading on it. By the time he gained control of my ICD, the battery was nearly depleted and I had been electrocuted dozens and dozens of times. After the ICD was shut off, I was taken by ambulance to a different hospital. The next morning, I woke up confused and disoriented. Panic set in when I looked to my left and saw this purple log attached to my body. It was my arm, swollen and discolored as a result of the electrical shocks. I could barely move it. I couldn't even clench my fist. I suddenly realized it wasn't just my arm that could be injured. What about my baby? I called for the nurse, anxious to know if my daughter was okay. I had just been shocked by a defibrillator inside my body, and I had no idea what that might do to an unborn child. The nurse let me listen to her heartbeat, reassuring me that she was alive and well, and soon afterward, the cardiac team came to speak with me about what had happened and how that was even possible. They disclosed that had I not been pregnant, I would likely not have survived the incident. My heart would have been irreversibly damaged by the electrical shocks. However, because I was pregnant, I had a nice protective cushion of water weight surrounding my nerves and organs. This tiny badass had, in a way, saved my life. They still didn't know why my ICD did what it did, but there was a recall on my particular model, and the damn thing needed to come out, which meant a new one had to go back in. Though that was incredibly difficult and I lived in fear every day of something like this happening again, I'm glad I didn't refuse a new ICD, simply because later in life I would experience cardiac arrest more than once, and the ICD saved me each time. I was discharged from the hospital a day or two later. I wanted to be home so badly, but as soon as my dad pulled into our driveway, my body started to shake, I felt dizzy, and I choked back tears. At the time, I didn't understand why this was happening, but I later learned this was PTSD. When the front door opened, I saw my mom and sister standing there, which pushed my emotions over the edge. I let go of everything I'd been holding in and melted into my mom's arms. Over the next several months, my body was recovering beautifully. However, it didn't take long for me to realize I was letting fear keep me from living my life. I didn't want my trauma to have control over my happiness, so I started EMDR therapy. After a handful of sessions, I was already doing much better. I felt guilty because I knew that night had left my family traumatized as well. They were all affected by what they saw and felt, and I will never really know what it was like for them. But I do know they're incredibly strong, resilient people, and I've been privileged to hear their experience anytime they've been willing to share. I don't necessarily know if I believe that everything happens for a reason, but I do believe in the strength and resilience of the human spirit. By telling this story, I hope it helps my family further process what took place. I hope it helps those listening who may have suffered trauma and are considering EMDR therapy. And lastly, I hope it reminds people that trauma doesn't deserve to control our happiness, and it most certainly doesn't have to.
For my entire childhood, I was the only child of a single mother growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. But at the age of 16, my mother found my father's family in Orlando, Florida, but discovered that he had died of testicular cancer 4 years earlier. Nonetheless, I got to know cousins and aunts and uncles, and through them, I got to know what my father, Joe, was like, with kind of vague ideas of what life could have been like had he met me and been a part of my life. And so, for the next 30 years, sometimes with large gaps in between, this was my extended family down in Florida. Fast forward to Christmas 2018, which was the first holidays I had with my new husband, and his mother had given us both the gift of an Ancestry DNA kit. This was so we could find out our ethnic national heritages, and particularly for my husband to see how Native American fit into his ancestry. Now, after my first test failed, I tried it again and finally got my results back in April of 2019. And one of the features of Ancestry DNA is the ability to see genetic matches and reach out to people who could be family members. Well, I started receiving messages from a particular woman down in South Alabama whose name I didn't recognize at all. I brought this up to my mother, who went silent. She recognized that last name. You see, back in 1972, she had dated 2 men, one named Joe and the other named Leroy. In her own mind and timeline, Joe seemed like the correct pick when it came to being my father. However, this DNA result indicated it was Leroy instead. Now, come to find out, both men had actually visited me as a baby, but at separate times, but neither wanting to take on the role of father at that time. But one of the most surprising stories my mother told me was that a favorite panda bear doll that I had as a kid actually came from Leroy's toy shop. Oh, and the woman who had messaged me on Ancestry DNA, turns out she is one of 3 half-sisters I now have on my father's side. Now, he is alive and well, and it's been quite the adjustment to no longer have a dead father or the need to worry about testicular cancer. But as of yet, Leroy has no interest in meeting me. So we'll see where that goes.
Hi, Scott. My name is Samantha, and I just was listening to your bonus episode of Childbirth Stories, and one thing was missing. My story. My second child, my son, was extremely healthy throughout the pregnancy. There were no indications of any health issues at all. The labor was fairly quick, and I wouldn't say easy, but he came out with no problem at all. I looked down at him and I said, "Oh, he has Down syndrome." And I remember very vividly the midwife shushing me. And I looked back at her and I said, look at him. Look at his eyes. They're almond shaped. They're beautiful, but he has Down syndrome. And I have to say that at that moment, it probably was the most frightened I've ever been and the most unsure. I had so many questions about what this child would be like. Would I be able to take care of him? Would he love me? Would he be able to speak? So many ridiculous thoughts that came through my mind. And I can say today that he is 9 years old and the greatest blessing of my life. I have grown so much as a person just being able to be his mother. He is smart. He is funny. He is mischievous. And my favorite part of his birth story is when I ask him, when you were born, what was the first word that you said to mommy? And he says, surprise.
My name is Carolyn. I was listening to podcast number 110, Jen is a Professional Bridesmaid, which was really a fun listen. It goes to show that there's a niche for everyone. Then my attention was drawn to the listener story at the end of the podcast, which was about Scott's own wedding. You see, my husband and I share the same anniversary date, July 7th. It brought up some memories for sure. We were married by the Justice of the Peace in Maine on July 7, 1977, which makes our anniversary date very easy to remember, 7777. The truth is, we really didn't pick that date. We had arrived in Maine on a vacation in early July, and at that point we had been together for 2 years, and we had been talking about getting married. So we thought, wouldn't it be great to get married in the quaint, beautiful town of Bar Harbor, Maine? So we went to the town hall to get our license and figured we'd get married that day. It was July 6th. However, Maine has this quirky law that a couple must wait a day after getting a license to actually get married. I guess it gives couples a chance to change their minds. So the next day was July 7th, and obviously we didn't change our minds. We did get married. But that wasn't the end of the story. On the way back home, we stopped by my new in-laws' cottage in New Hampshire, and out of the blue, my husband's father blurted out, "Isn't it about time you two got married?" My poor husband, taken off guard, stammered, yeah, that's a good idea. So right off the bat began the family's plans for a wedding. We didn't have the heart to tell them that we were already married. They wanted a full church wedding and all that goes with it. One problem was I didn't have a family, so I grew up in foster homes and there was no one to help me. I was on my own. I had to make decisions the best I could and be my own support system. And I knew nothing about the protocol of planning a wedding. Also, we didn't have much money and I had school loans to pay off. So finally, I spoke up and insisted on a simple wedding. I found a pretty dress off the rack and the reception was in my husband's family's backyard. Fortunately, the wedding went well and his family was happy and we were happy, and it cost us only $2,500. So that wedding date is September 3rd, 1977, 2 months from our first marriage date. I can't believe that it actually took us only 2 months to plan this wedding. Anyway, we have 2 marriage certificates and 2 dates. Later, we heard through the grapevine that there were some who thought our marriage would never last, probably because I'm 13 years older than my husband. But they were wrong, of course, and here it is 45 years later, and our marriage is still alive and well and going strong. We are truly suited for each other, and what we do know for sure is that we have each other and a soft place to land when things get tough. It's been a wild 45-year adventure. And I say good luck to all those who are planning a wedding. I know for sure that plans don't always go as plans. So be flexible and accept a change of plans and go with the flow.
Hi, Scott. I'd love an opportunity to tell you about my pregnancy in 2018. It was our first wedding anniversary when my husband and I found out that we were pregnant, and we were thrilled. Unfortunately, our excitement didn't last. At our 18-week anatomy scan, we learned that we were having a boy and that something was wrong. Our baby was measuring small, like way too small. At 21 weeks, I developed a potentially life-threatening maternal complication. And so, in order to continue the pregnancy, I would have to remain hospitalized until delivery. A few days into my hospitalization, a resident doctor walked into my room with the paperwork necessary to obtain an abortion. She explained to me that in our state, there was a 24-hour waiting period between filing this paperwork and obtaining the abortion. And due to the nature of my condition, I could go from stable to unstable very quickly, and my doctor didn't want there to be any red tape delaying my treatment. So it was best to have this paperwork on hand in the event that we needed it. I, of course, did not want an abortion. I wanted a baby. But I also knew that it was important for my doctor to practice medicine within the confines of the law. So I begrudgingly and in tears signed the paperwork. The resident then told me that she was also required by law to show me a booklet meant to educate me on normal fetal development. Of course, the baby in my body was not developing normally. She very mercifully held the booklet out in front of me, flipped through it as quickly as you would one of those animated flip books, said, "There, I showed it to you," threw the booklet in the trash, and walked out of the room. One morning, about 5 weeks into my hospitalization, I was taken from my room to an ultrasound, which I had been doing bi-weekly throughout my hospitalization. This ultrasound was different in that in the middle of it, the ultrasound tech put down her wand and said, "I'm going to go call your doctor. I'll be right back." And I knew that this couldn't be good. I still had no idea what was going on when less than an hour later, the door to my hospital room opened and my husband walked in. My husband was in his first year of an internal medicine residency at a hospital across town, so I hardly saw him at all, nonetheless at 9 a.m. on a weekday. Just a few minutes later, the door opened again, and in walked a pack of about 10 people, many of whom I had never seen before, but one of whom was my MFM, my maternal fetal medicine doctor. She told us that our baby had developed an additional complication in utero. And this complication was exceedingly dangerous for the mother, for the pregnant person. And it was no longer reasonable to continue the pregnancy. It was time for the pregnancy to end. A man from the group then introduced himself to us as the hospital's neonatologist. He explained that because our son was so growth restricted, that he was so small, they didn't have instruments small enough to perform the procedures on him that would be necessary in order to save his life. They didn't have breathing tubes small enough for his windpipe, and they didn't have IVs small enough for his blood vessels. To try and shove a tube down his throat that was too big for his throat would be akin to torture. And due to this new complication, his chances of survival were very slim, even in the best of circumstances. And with him being so small, he stood no chance. He would not and could not resuscitate the baby. The NICU team then left the room, and we were left to absorb the information that all hope for our son was lost. My MFM then explained to us that my baby was likely too weak to survive labor. So in order to avoid a quote-unquote abortion, she would need to deliver the baby via cesarean. That way, she could pull the baby out alive. After the baby came out alive, they would give the baby comfort care and allow the baby to die on the outside, all while I was being sewn up on the operating table. This plan was appalling to me. It was incredibly invasive and unnecessarily traumatic for both me and my son. But I thought I had no choice. I was 26 weeks pregnant in a state where at the time my choices ended a few weeks earlier. Now it's much, much earlier. So I took a shower and washed with the special soap intended to disinfect my belly before a planned cesarean. But as I stepped out of the shower, I decided that there was no way that this was how it was going to go down. I wanted to be induced. Well, obviously, what I wanted was a healthy baby and a healthy pregnancy. But given my circumstances, I wanted to be induced and to deliver my baby vaginally. even if that meant he came out dead, even if that was against the law, even if it meant putting my very wonderful MFM's medical license at risk. I wanted my son to have as peaceful of a death as possible. I wanted him to be warm and to hear my beating heart and to be held inside of me as his little life slipped away. He was my son and I was his mother. And if this was my one and only chance to protect him, so be it. I told my OB that I refused the cesarean. She agreed that the cesarean was not medically necessary and that ultimately the outcome for my son would be the same. Many hours of brainstorming, pleading, and phone calls followed, all from my hospital bed. Eventually, the hospital agreed that if my case was reviewed by another MFM from a separate practice, and I was interviewed by another doctor, and the doctors agreed, I could be permitted the induction. 14 hours after that morning's ultrasound, the induction began. And I quickly had to change my mindset from fighting with the bureaucracy to preparing myself mentally and emotionally to do what I was about to do. And I just prayed and prayed and prayed that I would be brave enough to do it. I labored for 26 hours and he came out dead. He was so incredible to look at, and I just was overwhelmed with this duality of meeting my baby for the first time. He was finally here, but he was also gone. I kept his body in my hospital room with me for 2 nights. And on the 3rd day, when the funeral director came to pick him up, I had to hand him over to him. And it was honestly one of the most painful experiences of my life. Much of what happened to me and to my son was nobody's fault. God's will is a mystery, and Mother Nature can be cruel. But it was made so much worse by the politics that surround pregnancy. My son's name was Alex. He was so wanted and so loved. Being his mother is one of the greatest honors of my life, and I will mourn him until the day I die.
In the year 2000, which sounds like the future but is really the past, I was a young kid who had no money but wanted to travel around all the time, of course, like many young kids. So I went to Israel. And there was an uprising, and my parents were freaking out every day. So I went backpacking in Egypt for a while, and they freaked out even more because I couldn't go back. So I left in the middle of a college semester, and I couldn't just rejoin my university. So I headed down to Mexico to take some Spanish classes, kill some time until the following semester. And of course, I had nowhere to stay. So I found a place through friends of friends of friends on the roof, literally on the roof of these old people's house in Mexico City. And this wasn't in a normal neighborhood. It was kind of like this. A lot of the houses were unfinished cinder block. There wasn't a whole lot of public transport around. There were these buses that would take you somewhere for $1, and occasionally, but very rarely, a taxi would drive by. And one day, about 8 p.m., 7 p.m., I was going to meet a friend of mine down in the center of Mexico City, and I decided, you know what? I'm dressed nice. I'm going to take a taxi. I don't want to take the bus and walk and be all dirty. So I flagged down a taxi. It took me a while, but I got kind of lucky, and one drove by, and I didn't have any cash. And so I told the driver, hey, I need to go to the ATM. I only have a credit card. And he said, no problem, no problem. Now, this is Mexico City. I wanted to go directly to the center, right near the presidential palace. It's called the Zocalo. Every driver knows where this is. Well, the taxi driver's driving further and further away from this. And that was weird to me. Mexico City is shaped like a bowl. If you go up, you're going further away from the center. If you're going down, you're going towards the center. It's essentially, the whole city is sinking. So it's real easy to navigate by sight when you're going to the center anyway. And I knew we were going the wrong way. So finally, I asked him, and I said, where are we going? And I thought, maybe there's traffic, maybe there's an accident. But he said, I'm going to ask my friend for directions. Now, this was a major red flag, because this is like a cabbie in Washington, D.C. saying he's going to ask for directions when you want to go to the White House, or a New York cabbie having to ask for directions to take you to Times Square. Just didn't add up, didn't make any sense. And this is before mobile phones. So I wasn't scrolling Instagram or social media and distracting myself. I was looking out the window and worrying if I was about to get kidnapped. Now, my brain's thinking, well, you've never been kidnapped before, so why would you get kidnapped now? And I realized that was a logical fallacy. And I started to think, what if I am getting kidnapped? What if this guy's taking me to the proverbial place where nobody can hear you scream? I don't really want to do that to myself. You know, I got a whole life ahead of me. What is going to happen? So I told him to just let me out. He said no. I told him to drive me back to where I was and I would pay him. And he said, hey, I thought you said you didn't have any cash on you. And I was like, damn, of course, I should have played that one closer to the vest. And that's when I realized I'm either going to get robbed. You know, people are going to get in the car and take me around, or I'm going to get chopped up into little pieces or something like that in a basement. I don't want to find out which one of these it is. And I tried to get out, but the door locks actually sunk below flush with the door handle, and I couldn't get the door open. And I thought, this is actually a kidnap mobile, intentionally or not. The doors won't open. I can't get the door open at all. I can't unlock it myself. So the driver kept going. I kept trying to figure out ways to finagle to get out. He kept sort of acting friendly, but a little agitated because he knew I was agitated. And I knew something was up, because if somebody wants to get out of your car that bad and you're not up to something, you let the creep out of your car. But he would not go for it. Finally, he stops in front of this cinder block house, and it's really looking bad. This is a really rough area. There's no street lighting. The roads are really awful. And I'm thinking, this is sort of a bad neighborhood, right? This is not a place where happy, productive people live and work and play. And I was sitting behind him, and he didn't really notice that. I slid from this behind the passenger seat to behind the driver's side. I put my arm between him and the door quietly, and I said, don't get out of the car. Keep driving. I don't want to get out here. Go back to a place that has better lighting. And he said, this is my friend's house. Relax. I'm just going to ask for directions. Now, remember, again, pre-mobile phones, he couldn't call anyone to ask for directions. He couldn't get directions online. He also couldn't warn anyone that he was coming in advance. So I figure he's going to run out, go to the house, get a couple of thugs. They're going to get in the car with me. And that's the best case scenario. The worst case is they drag me out of the car and nobody ever hears from me again. So I told him again in no uncertain terms to get out of here. You know, we are leaving. We are not getting out here. Instead, he made a fast one for the door. And again, remember, I had my arm between him and the door, and he didn't make it out of the car. I was 20 years old. I worked out twice a day, and I ate carne asada nonstop. He was 50-something years old or even older, and he sat in a cab all day, maybe eating the occasional burrito or rice bowl, and he was not in good shape. There was a physical altercation. He ended up losing that physical altercation. He got choked out, basically, by me from the back seat. Still couldn't get the car door open. Pushed him out of his driver's side door. Tried to drive. Guess what? Stick shift, 1968. Not only can you not drive that if you don't know the trick with the clutch and the shifter and all that stuff, it's an old car. And even if you can drive stick, you're freaking out. You're vibrating at about 1,000 RPM or whatever your wrists and hands are doing at that point with all that adrenaline. No way was I going to figure that out that moment. Took the keys and threw them. 20/20 hindsight, should have kept the keys, but nothing ever came of it. Threw them, ran until I couldn't run anymore, and I got to a main road, and a couple stopped and picked me up. Now, they didn't want to pick me up. I looked like a crazy person, but I was wearing Banana Republic chinos and a nice blue dress shirt that I had soaked through with sweat. I had fake blonde hair. I was 20, forgive me here. I had fake blonde hair. Finally, someone stopped and said, what's going on? And I said, I got kidnapped. And they said, what are you talking about? And I said, get me out of here. And they're like, I'm not letting you in the car, you sweaty gringo. So finally, I offered to ride in the trunk of a car, and they didn't make me do that. They let me sit in the back seat, and they offered to take me somewhere. I said, take me to the police, which is when I got a nice sort of tongue lashing about how the police are probably in on any kidnapping scheme that's going on in the area. And also, where's that cabbie? Is he still alive? If he's not, you could be in deeper trouble than you think. And I thought, these are all very valid points. So the guy wouldn't take me home. He didn't want to know where I lived. So he took me to a metro station. And that night, I packed up all my crap in the middle of the night and got the first bus real early. Spent most of the time at the bus station real early, moved to a different city, and never went back.
Well, this is interesting. traumatic, but I laugh at anything traumatic that's happened. So I recently moved. I know that you're actually located in Florida, and I just moved to a small town called Dunedin. Really small, cute, quaint, safe town right outside of Clearwater. I had gotten into an argument with my boyfriend. We were at a brewery. We live about a mile down the road, and I said I was going to walk home, which is something that I normally do. I have a dog. Less than a mile down the street. It got a little dark. I had more to drink than I had anticipated, and, I was just walking. So as I'm down a couple blocks, this guy pulls up and gets out of his car and shoves me into his car. It was terrifying. The guy kept trying to touch me and, touch my legs, and I was just pushing him off me. Eventually, we got to a parking lot. I guess it was some bar. He was trying, he was clearly trying to assault me. I was able to get out of the car, and I said I needed to pee, and so he actually took my shorts off of me, which is just absolutely insane. I hid behind a dumpster, and I was able to text my boyfriend where I was. So the next thing I know, my boyfriend comes rolling up and sees a strange man staring at me behind a dumpster, and I don't have my pants on. And I am terrified. I am crying. My boyfriend sucks the guy and then gets me, and we leave. He begs me to call the cops, but unfortunately I've been the victim of sexual assault in the past, and it's not turned out very well. It's just more traumatizing. And since I wasn't actually hurt, I would say attempted abduction, attempted assault, but nothing actually happened to me. I felt like it's fine. I'll just continue with my therapy. The interesting part is that I lost my phone. So after I realized that, I canceled it. My phone was taken, and the next day it was logged in Louisiana. So I think I dodged a trafficking attempt. Not really sure, but I'm very lucky to be here, and I'm just puts things in perspective. So that's kind of what happens, even in the safest town. So be safe.
Hi, I'm Bill Mitchell. Back in 1972, I was an art student at the Maryland Institute College of Art. Today, they call that school MICA. It's in Baltimore, Maryland. I was a graphic designer, at least I was working my way into becoming one. Way before I went to art school, I was very much into the work of the paintings of Norman Rockwell. Some people would refer to Rockwell as an illustrator, and they wouldn't allow that he was actually an artist. Fine artists didn't see him as a fine artist or even an artist. He was an illustrator, which was their way of saying he got paid for what he did. But I was very much into him. And in the summer of 1972, I was 21, and I had to go to pick up some things at a store. And there was a rack of paperbacks there. And I saw a book called My Adventures as an Illustrator by Norman Rockwell. So I picked it up because I was curious to see the backstory on Norman Rockwell, and I just couldn't put it down. It took his story all the way back to being a little boy, a little scrawny boy growing up in New England, and kind of took you through his time working as the top art person at Boys Life, and then doing paintings for them and drawings for them, and later his work with the Saturday Evening Post and the paintings he did for World War II, and on and on and on. I mean, just thousands of paintings, I guess, really. And I thought, well, wait a minute, how old is this man? And I found out that he was 78, which when you're 21 or 22, somebody's 78, it seems like that guy could leave us at any moment. And I thought, well, wow, I'd really love to meet this man. I didn't know where he lived precisely. So I sent out some letters, and I tried to find out through the library. Of course, in 1972, you had no access to the internet, didn't have Google. But I found out he lived in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And I thought, I've got to meet this guy. I've got to shake his hand. I need to make contact with him. So all I knew was that he lived in Stockbridge. And on the map, of course, I could see it's going to take me a while to get there. And I thought, I'm doing this. Around the corner lived my girlfriend, who is currently now my wife all these years. So anyway, the deal was I'd pick her up at about 3 a.m. and we would just go to Stockbridge. Didn't have an address, didn't have an invitation. We're going to meet this guy. So off we went, my little Volkswagen, and got up there somewhere around, I'd say 9 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't have an address, so I thought I'd just meet people and ask where Norman Rockwell lives. Well, they didn't really want to tell me. They looked at him as he's kind of this treasure of theirs, and they're not going to have some guy from out of town just go and bother this man. I mean, I actually stopped, saw some guys getting ready to tee off on a golf course, ran up to them. They looked at each other and said, well, we really don't want to say. I couldn't get it out of anyone until I bumped into some guy who was mowing a lawn. I walked up and was a young kid, and I asked if he knew where Norman Rockwell lived, and he said he lives around the corner here. Just go down the end of the street, make a right, take a look down a gray gravel driveway, and you'll see his studio. And I'd seen pictures of the studio. I'd read this book. We kind of drove down that way, and my wife and I got out, and I was plenty nervous. Started walking up this short driveway and could see through the side window, which was like the northern window, because artists or illustrators know to have the northern light coming in through the window because it doesn't change as much during the course of a day, so that their paintings won't change colors as much because of the light. But I could see this white-haired man inside, and I just said, that's got to be him. So we started to go up the driveway a little bit, and then a door opened. I thought it was him, but it wasn't. Some man who looked like he's probably more like 50 years old, who walked up and intercepted us, and kind of a big guy. And he walked up and he said, what's this all about? And I told him who I was. I was this art student, and I introduced my wife to be. And I said, I just wanted to come up and meet this great man. He had influenced me so much. And he said, look, I really appreciate the fact that you came up here, but Mr. Rockwell has been traveling. He just got back yesterday, and he has things to do in the studio today. So I'm just sorry. It's so nice of you to come up, but I can't. And I thought about the book, and I ventured, are you Louis Lamoni? And he said, well, yeah, I am. And I turned to my wife. I said, wow, this man is Louis Lamoni. And back in 1954, Mr. Rockwell had projects to do and needed photos taken as reference for his paintings. And as it turns out, he found out about Louis Lamoni here, and he was an amateur photographer, and darn if they didn't strike up this relationship. And I turned to him and I said, and I guess it's still going strong. And he said, well, yes, it is. So this man was pretty impressed that I'd done my homework and I was really into this. I wasn't just some pesky tourist. So he said, I can't really make any promises, but I can go and talk with them, and I'll let you know what happens. And the next thing you know, he went into the studio and came back and said, well, as it turns out, Mr. Rockwell said, you can come in for a few minutes, you can meet him. So we must have spent the better part of an hour in that studio with Norman Rockwell, with Louis Lamoni. I didn't even ask, and he started giving me a tour of his studio. He showed me where he keeps his brushes and where he cleans them, and he's shown me his easel, which was set up there. And so that was it. That was our meeting with Norman Rockwell. And it was just this perfect day. It was August of 72. I'll never forget it. And to me, I usually use that story as one of these things where it's like, if you really have your heart set on something, you should pursue it. I didn't really think, that I would meet him and have that happen like it did. It was just a perfect meeting, just long enough, just great enough. And so anyway, I just wanted to share that, and thank you for listening.
Hi, Scott. When I was an emergency dispatcher back in the early 2000s, I was working on a Christmas Eve. My officers were out searching for a parolee at large who was armed and dangerous. We had the helicopter out, shining lights on the streets and neighborhood where he was last seen. The search lasted for hours, and he got away. The next night was Christmas, and I was also working when I received a call from a young mother thanking me for the helicopter and the lights in her neighborhood the night before. The commotion woke her toddler up, and when she saw the lights out her window, she started pointing and jumping up and down, screaming, Santa Claus, Santa Claus. The mom was so happy that we helped her child believe. I loved it. I love your podcast. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Mark from Shorewood, Illinois. I worked in minor league baseball for 5 years. My assigned job was the marketing department, but in the minors, everyone wears a lot of hats and pitches in wherever they can. This meant I spent a good amount of time in a mascot suit. The majority of my time in the suit was with a team in South Florida called the Stone Crabs. You can imagine the heat of being in a thick, furry suit at noon on a July day in Florida. If you can get through the sweat, though, being a mascot can be a pretty magical job. People constantly call your name, want to take pictures with you, and even have you sign things. Cards, baseballs, programs. I even had a kid give me his shoe and another give me his bare arm to sign. I also got to dance on the dugout in front of a sellout crowd of 4,000 roaring fans. The one story that captures the true power of a mascot, however, is this. One night, as I did my laps around the park, a few kids started following me. I turned around, gave them high fives, posed for pictures, and did all my usual routine, then turned to walk elsewhere. The kids kept following me, and I noticed that there were more kids than there were last time. I decided to see how far they would go with this, so I started marching, swinging my arms dramatically at my sides. They copied it. So I began marching my way around the entire stadium, and they followed. As we approached the third base seating section, fans starting to clap in time with our march. We continued on through the bowl. I led, the kids followed, and the clapping grew. Here was this mascot leading a band of children around the ballpark. It was really quite incredible. We must have made 2 or 3 laps before the kids finally grew tired and went back to their families, but not before a few group photos were taken by grateful parents. It's amazing how much power a shag carpet with a funny nose can have.